more athletes' healthcare costs, and Mr. Michael McCann and Matthew Mitten, who will discuss some of the more thorny legal issues related to name, image, and likeness and how we could move forward. As I said, I really believe that this is the time to make progress on this issue. Mr. Mitten brought up in his testimony, I think, a very interesting point, not to steal his thunder, but his report says, quote, prior to the 23 adoption of WADC, which provides the basis for International Convention Against Doping in the sport, and that was later ratified, that a serious balkanization happened with various states doing different things and thereby leaving an unfair and unjustified hometown favoritism. We can't afford that now. What we can afford is to take care of our students and student athletes. It's so important for us to listen to the voices that have made so many of these points clear. Dallas Hobbs, a football player at Washington State University, called attention to inadequate COVID protections and formed a group of unity with Pac-12 players. We also have heard from Sedona Prince, a college basketball player from the University of Oregon, who shined a spotlight on a persistent gender divide in college sports when she posted a video that literally compared her workout room to the workout room of male athletes during the Final Four tournament. So we can do better. I believe that Title IX should be part of this conversation and applied to the NCAA. So we will have many chances today to get clarity on these issues, but I welcome everybody in the hopes that this discussion today will move us forward on legislation. So Senator Booker, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your legislation, and we look forward to hearing your comments this morning. I'm sorry, Senator, oh my gosh.
My name is CORY Booker.
It's already been a long week.
It's been a long week.
My dear colleague, Senator Wicker, has been such a leader here, and so appreciate his partnership on so many fronts. And I turn to him for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding today's hearing, and I appreciate your comments and subscribe to the tone and objective that you outlined. It's a very important day to discuss the issue of college athletes' name, image, and likeness, NIL rights. Last year, the Commerce Committee held multiple hearings on this subject. We heard from stakeholders with a wide variety of perspectives, representing large and small colleges and universities, conferences, student athlete groups, and academia. As a result of that process, and because of the insights gained from responses to letters I sent on behalf of the committee to dozens of institutions, the proper role of what Congress needs to do on NIL has become clearer. There is broad consensus that Congress should pass a law that guarantees college athletes the right to enter into NIL agreements with third parties, the same right that all of their fellow non-athlete students have. Such a law should have guardrails in place to prevent pay-for-play schemes and to safeguard student athletes from being taken advantage of by unscrupulous actors. A federal NIL law also needs to ensure that institutions, conferences, and athletic associations are not held liable for past rules governing NIL compensation during the transition to a new system. And it should be preemptive of state law, creating a single national standard providing the same rights and protections to all student athletes across the country. For my part, I sought to take the first steps toward such a law when I introduced the Collegiate Athlete Compensation Rights Act late last year. This Congress, I credit Senator Cantwell for moving quickly to start negotiations on a bipartisan path toward NIL legislation. And time is of the essence because the Senate Commerce Committee has certainly not been the only body taking up the NIL issue. In recent years, 18 states have signed NIL bills into law, the first of them set to go into effect on July 1st of this year, less than 1 month away. After that date, some college athletes will be able to avail themselves of opportunities related to their name, image, and likeness, and some will not. Schools and programs in some states will be able to gain a recruiting advantage under these new laws, and some will not. One of those state NIL laws will be going into effect in my state of Mississippi, and I'm glad to know that student athletes at Ole Miss, Jackson State, MSU, Southern Miss, and other institutions will not be completely disadvantaged. However, inconsistencies between state laws are already emerging. The only way to ensure that all student athletes across the country have the same NIL rights and protections is for Congress to act. I understand that NIL is not the only issue of importance in the world of college athletics. In our bipartisan talks, we have spent a significant amount of time on issues such as providing better health care and support for educational outcomes among our college athletes. These issues deserve deep and thoughtful consideration, especially as they overlap with the jurisdiction and expertise of other committees. But unlike NIL, these issues are not subject to a July 1st deadline. Based on our discussions, I believe we can reach consensus on a focused bill addressing NIL on a much faster timetable. To that end, I expect the testimony of today's witnesses will be quite helpful. I look forward to discussing with each of them the latest developments on the NIL issue and the need for federal legislation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Wicker, and thank you for your continued focus on this issue, and certainly appreciate the bipartisan discussions that we've all been having. Now we will turn to our colleague, Senator Booker, and again want to point out that both Senators Moran and Blumenthal have also been very much a part of this discussion and have held many subcommittee efforts to focus on this issue and on our lead Democrat and Republican as it related to the Olympic reform bill that we passed out of this committee as well. So we have successfully passed bipartisan legislation. Hopefully we can again. Senator Booker, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman. I cannot say how grateful I am and humbled that you would include me in a formal hearing, and how appreciative I am that we have been having bipartisan discussions and the earnestness with which your office and the ranking member's office have been treating this, the seriousness with which they've been treating this. I want to give my gratitude to Senator Moran. I know he has been a champion for justice in athletics writ large, and it's extraordinarily affirming to me that he is leaning into this as well. And of course, my partner and friend throughout this whole process, I'm just thankful for him as well. I want to just say I am deeply sorry that we're here. I was a newly minted senator sitting, when the room was configured differently, in this room in a hearing with a person I've come to have a lot of respect for, the head of the NCAA, talking about these issues. And nothing or very little has changed. I really respect what Senator Wicker is saying. We are here because of the real threat to college sports as we know it, with a whole bunch of different cross-cutting standards that will undermine the level playing field, or at least the degrees of the level playing field we have now. If we don't fix this problem, sports as we know will change it, and we all should feel that urgency. But it is unfortunate that these issues that we think are ancillary are really central, because if we don't use this opportunity to address the very painful issues that we see, from the gender issues that continue to persist, to the health and safety issues that continue to persist, from the exploitative issues around education that continue to exist. I am telling you right now, from my experience in my entire arc as a senator, they have not changed from the hearing we had 7 years ago. There is no guarantee that they're going to change or that there'll be any urgency to act on these issues. That's why we're drawing a line. Modern college athletics is a de facto for-profit industry that is just too often exploiting men and women, taking advantage of their genius, of their talent, of their artistry, robbing many of them of earnings in their peak years, leaving them often injured with a lifetime worth of costs. Sometimes looking back, and their universities are still making profits off of their names. The changes we are talking about should allow athletes, as I think we all agree, to benefit from their significant commercial value. that is now being cynically exploited to the profits in an industry that's making $15 to $25 billion. Large companies, even their own schools, are profiting off of them, and they're sharing in nothing with that. But there are deeper issues that we should talk about as well that have not been fixed. Since 2000 alone, we've seen the death of at least 30 players who have died from heat-related illnesses. We now have a better understanding of what concussion does to athletes throughout their lives. But we are sitting here at a time that the NCAA doesn't even have enforceable concussion protocols. Are our student athletes, are they really the center? If they were, we would do something about the forces that are creating such a dangerous environment for them, because the truth is, the incentives are imbalanced. I've been on a field where the game is on the line, where millions of dollars are at stake, win bonuses, and television contracts on whether we win or lose. The incentives are to keep that player with a concussion in. I know players, I've sat and talked with them, I'm sorry there's not players here for this hearing, that have painful stories about spine injuries, head injuries, neck injuries, who are going out of pocket to pay for them, with no help from universities that made millions of dollars off of them. I've talked to people who were used to put people in seats and make incredible amounts of money for the university, but we know their chances of getting a college degree at a time that they're spending 50, 60, 70 hours a week, they're robbed out of that college degree. And I know the NCAA brags about a 90% graduation rate, but in the revenue-generating sports, which disproportionately African Americans are present in, only 56% of black male athletes who generate the outsized amount of college sports revenue are graduating within 6 years. These things should be painful to all of us. They've been talked about for decades, since the time I was playing almost 30 years ago, and nothing has changed. Once an athlete's eligibility is gone, and thus their scholarships expires, they're little used to this multi-billion-dollar industry, but where is our heart? Where is our protections from them? To race to just an NIL bill and not address these injustices is tragic, because the theory, the story we sell is that this is about the kids, this is about the athletes, but that is fundamentally not true. And so the expiration of an athlete's college career should not mean that they're expendable. Now is the time for the NCAA to evolve as an organization, to truly put the students first and their concerns and their needs. So some people want to make this process simple as possible. Pass a narrow piece of legislation as this July 1st deadline comes that I admit is an existential threat to sports as we know it. But I'm saying no, we cannot do that. I encourage this committee to focus on the broader concerns. Make this not about the profit, but about the people. Make this not about continuing the billion-dollar industry and protecting it as we know it, but elevating the floor to make sure that we address these concerns that I know I've spoken to the heart of many of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I know we care about the education, the health, the well-being, and yes, the opportunity to make profit off of your name, image, and likeness. I want to conclude by saying this. I've come to have a lot of respect for people that are in this game. I'm very close to college coaches and athletic directors. I've been so touched by how many have reached out to me over the last year. Just Notre Dame's leadership reached out to me, and I thought they would never do that because, for the record, I had my best career game against them. I think it was an NCAA record 60 catches, I think?
I think that was at 60.
It's 60 catches, yes.
Or 70, I forgot.
Somewhere around there, sir. I hear from them that they are appalled that we haven't changed this. My most recent discussion with an athletic leader was, hey, what we do in our school should be the standard everywhere, but it's just not. I'm telling you what's going on right now is a quiet injustice. Senator Blumenthal and I have made a lot of time to hear directly from athletes, incredible women, incredible young men. Their stories are agonizing. We cannot trust that this will fix itself. This is the moment. This is the opportunity. And if we delay justice for those athletes, justice delayed is justice denied. I hope we will take advantage of this opportunity to fix these problems and make college athletics again, or for the first time, truly about the athletes that are involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Booker, and thank you for your passion. Thanks for joining us today, and you've really set the crux of what we're going to try to talk about today, and that is how do we cover some of these issues of healthcare and scholarship and have a discussion with our panelists about how we can get that done.
Madam Chair, if I could ask just a quick question
Certainly,
before Senator Booker leaves.
Yep.
Just to put a fine point on it, and I appreciate your reference to our partnership and friendship and our listening to the athletes. What we need here, in essence, is a Bill of Rights for college athletes. Would you agree?
Obviously, as you and I have been part of authoring an athlete's Bill of Rights, I've talked to now lots of people, and everybody agrees that the basic protections on gender issues, on health and safety issues, this is the least we can ask in an industry that makes so much money. I know when the NCAA tournament came to Newark when I was mayor, I was blown away by the wealth, but then yet you have student athletes telling their stories like we saw in the most recent tournament along gender issues. How could we possibly be in 2021 and not have the kind of basic protections for young people and fairness, from transfer rules to the ability to actually get an education at schools where athletes are still, like I did, putting in more than a full-time job's worth in their sport. So I think the word Bill of Rights, whether that's triggering or not to some of my colleagues, the reality is we need to raise the floor for the protections of these athletes. And again, my friend, I'm grateful for you and my colleagues across this dais for your heart and your concern about athletes' needs.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Booker, again, thank you so much for being here. And we're now going to turn to our panelists so we can have a discussion about these various issues. I want to welcome to the dais, as I said, head coach Mark Few from Gonzaga University, Dr. Dr. Wayne Frederick, president of Howard University, Dr. Mark EMMERT, the head of the NCAA. He will be followed by Mr. Rod Gilmore, who is at a remote location, but will be joining us after Dr. Frederick, Mr. Michael McCann, and Mr. Matthew Mitten. Again, welcome to all of you. You can see we've been doing a lot of work, and people have a lot of ideas about what the bottom line is. I think today, we hope you will help us illuminate some ways and paths forward, and appreciate you all being here. Again, appreciate certainly Coach Few being here and traveling from my home state, the state of Washington. So welcome, Coach Few. Yep. I think you might have to push a red button there. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Well, hey, tough act to follow. But I want to thank you for allowing me to testify about the future of college sports and the framework for federal name, image, likeness legislation for our student athletes. And I would especially like to thank Chair Cantwell and Ranking Member Wicker. My name is Mark Few, and I'm the head men's basketball coach at Gonzaga. Being the son of a Presbyterian minister and listening to over 50 years of Dad's sermons, I understand the value of keeping this short, so I'm going to do my best at that. I started coaching at Gonzaga in 1990 as a graduate assistant, which was basically a volunteer position. At that time, Gonzaga was in a really tough position financially, and there were discussions of moving down divisions and even reducing athletic offerings. Since then, we have slowly worked our way up over many years and are now considered one of the top basketball programs in the country, which I think helps give me a really, really unique perspective on this very difficult matter. We, as previously mentioned, we are at a critical juncture in college athletics, and it really isn't an exaggeration to say the future of college sports is in jeopardy. And so I want to talk about kind of NIL rights. We absolutely should have addressed these NIL rights a long time ago. And I'm embarrassed that we're here and having to deal with it right now. We should have handled this, but here it is. And these changes are long, long overdue. All athletes deserve to use their own name, image, and likeness in commercial endorsements and on social media. And I am very much in favor of them profiting as much as they possibly can from this. They should be able to run a camp using their own name, sign autographs for money, or profit off their popularity on Instagram or TikTok. And that absolutely needs to happen right now. We don't need an artificial cap on what a player's value is for NIL. We should rely on fair market value. But we do need some parameters to preserve the collegiate model and protect the recruiting environment. Without these parameters, the unintended consequences could be disastrous. And they could be disastrous, especially for the non-revenue sports outside of football and men's basketball. So my second point is, we need your help. At this point, this is not an issue the NCAA or individual states can fix. We can't run competitive, fair championships if every state has a different rule. And state NIL laws go into effect in less than a month. We have players showing up on campus here this week. So only action here by Congress can maintain some sort of semblance of a level playing field. A consistent national law is critical. For instance, I have the same number of scholarships to offer as my counterparts at universities 10 times the size of Gonzaga. That is the one way a Jesuit school with 5,300 undergraduate students competes in the national championship game twice in the past 4 NCAA tournaments. In regards to student welfare, in the last 4 or 5 years, and like I said, I've been involved in college athletics for 32 years now. But in the last 4 or 5, I've witnessed the most drastic changes in regards to student-athlete welfare, and fully acknowledging we have a long ways to go. But at Gonzaga, we provide out-of-pocket health care expenses for 2 years. After a student-athlete's injury, we pay for medical insurance. We provide scholarship if a student wants to return to school after their eligibility is expired, even if they're playing professionally. And we continue that for as long as they want to try and finish their degree. We provide one-on-one guidance on nutrition and all the food they could possibly ever want or need, access to mental health services like coping with depression, suicide prevention, and even peak mental sports performance training. We offer elite strength and conditioning training, equipment, cost of attendance stipends, access to disability insurance policies, extensive life skills programming, and literally every bit of academic apparel and shoes that they would ever need. And it is my belief that all student athletes should have 2 years out-of-pocket expenses at minimum covered after they're done playing for any athletic injuries covered. They should also have the ability to come back to school and finish their degree after their eligibility is expired. The fact that we do that at Gonzaga, I guess we just kind of take it for granted. But schools that cannot afford to provide this care to their student athletes should be able to get assistance from the NCAA because it is the right thing to do. In order to make that happen, the NCAA probably needs temporary relief from the myriad of lawsuits that might follow or are currently in court. My final point I want to talk about is the value in a college experience. In men's basketball, there are options available now to players who do not want to be a part of that collegiate model and would prefer to be professionals. Our top high school players are actively recruited to the G League, have opportunities to play overseas, or even play in new high school professional leagues, supposedly offering 6-figure salaries. These guys have options. If their goal is to get paid to play right away, they can do that. And sometimes college athletics isn't for everyone. However, big however, there are so many positive things going on in college athletics that we don't hear about and experiences that are worth preserving and supporting. Kids who are able to go to college and be the first in their family to step in a college classroom and walk across the stage at graduation. Students encouraged to access mental health counseling that maybe they didn't realize they needed. academic support, and opportunities to prepare for life after college. Players who find a second family in the coaches and support staff of the university dedicated to ensuring they develop into the adults they should become. This year alone has been an incredible challenge, and the guys brought amazing resilience and grit and perseverance because they wanted to compete. They wanted to play. They wanted to join their brothers and find joy again by playing the sport they love at an elite level. While we know there are challenges that remain in college athletics, I don't want to forget all the good happening on campuses throughout the entire country. Can't tell you how many times my athletes have come back years after competing at Gonzaga and told me that being here was the greatest time of their lives. Some of those guys are still currently playing in the NBA, and others never played a minute after leaving Gonzaga. In closing, the NCAA and college sports model in the United States is unlike anything else. There really is no comparison. No model to emulate, and it has provided access to higher education to millions of students. Hopefully we can find a solution that will empower, educate, and provide an opportunity for these students to capitalize on their own NIL without compromising what makes attending college and playing college sports such a special and transformational experience. Thanks.
Thank you, Coach Few. Thank you very much for being here and for that testimony. Very helpful. Dr. Frederick, thank you so much for being here. Look forward to hearing your statement.
Sorry. Chairwoman Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker. Chairwoman Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker, and members of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. I want to thank you for the opportunity to offer testimony on the issue of NCAA athletes' rights, particularly those pertaining to name, image, and likeness monetization. Today, I'm representing the Mid-Eastern Athletic Conference as the chair of the MEAC's presidents and chancellors, but I'm also here as the parent of a 16-year-old who will be 17 on Saturday, is a soccer player and is being actively recruited by over a dozen universities, other than mine, I might add. I'm also representing my own institution, Howard University, which is the only historically black college and university to win a Division I NCAA championship, and that was in the sport of soccer in the 1970s, as well as the more than 100 historically black colleges and universities throughout the country. I'm a practicing surgeon and also served as the manager of that NCAA Division I team that had a history of winning that championship. In our institutions, academics and athletics are each critical components of the education we provide. In the classroom and on the volleyball court, we teach our students the importance of transcendence and perseverance in overcoming any barrier they may encounter. But we also teach them to become their own self-advocates and to insist on fairness and equity. This is a balance we should seek to strike in college athletics, both on and off the court. I'm here today to express the MEAC's support for legislation that allows collegiate athletes to receive compensation for use of their name, image, and likeness. We believe that student athletes should be able to retain agents and professional representatives who can help them maximize earnings as well as handle certification and ensure compliance with regulations. In addition, we also support legislation that would protect students who face sports-related injury and medical expenses from incurring undue financial burdens. Student athletes put tremendous effort and dedication into their athletic activities, and they deserve to be compensated for those endeavors and protected in the course of pursuing them. However, it is critical we recognize that college athletics is not purely or principally a money-making venture, and it is neither in the best interest of the students or the institutions for it to be so. Sports in the landscape of higher education is indeed a part of a student's education. Even as we work to provide student athletes with greater rights to earn compensation, we should also seek to protect the amateur status of these sports. At the MEAC, our enthusiasm for increasing the rights of student athletes is tempered by our concerns for lesser resourced institutions. Many smaller schools simply don't have the funds to take on additional financial responsibilities. If they were required to pay for additional student-athlete medical expenses or field more staff to ensure compliance with rules and regulations around student-athlete compensation, The resulting strain would inevitably force them to downsize or eliminate certain athletic offerings entirely. We desperately need federal legislation that would supersede the patchwork of laws that exist on a state level, and we need comprehensive laws that apply equally to student athletes across the country, while also recognizing and accounting for the diversity across collegiate athletic programs. As a representative of the MEAC and HBCUs, I have concerns about many of the proposals that would create tremendous burdens on smaller colleges and universities, particularly those historically Black institutions that do not have the same resources as some of our wealthier and more privileged peers. And I take this opportunity to remind you that Howard University is the only historically Black college and university where a 5-star athlete has decided to enroll, as did McCurmaker this past year. It is important to recognize that out of 1,100 college athletic programs in the NCAA, only 25 programs, some 2.27%, are profitable. The overwhelming majority of colleges and universities extend significant institutional resources to support athletics. For example, each year, Howard University expends approximately some $14 million to support our sports teams. If new rules and regulations only add to the cost that we assume without providing us with any additional assistance, we will not be able to sustain the athletic programs we currently have. And we offer some 21 Division I sports at present. We have the only swimming team at a historically Black college and university. And that's just not about swimming, but it's about the African-American experience in this country. African Americans are 5 times more likely to drown, for example. So our swim team has athletes that will compete, hopefully at the Olympics, but we also have athletes who are interested in spreading the learning of swimming throughout the African American community. This would be a tremendous loss to our institution as well as to the students whose opportunities for academic and athletic educational experience would be limited as a result. So it is with tremendous conviction that we at the MEAC advocate for expanding student rights to earn compensation and receive much-needed protections for their well-being. However, we strongly believe that guardrails must be established that would protect smaller colleges and universities, as well as the student athletes who are not well-positioned to earn compensation from their athletic pursuits or who play smaller sports that could be eliminated if the institutions lack the wherewithal to support them. And to piggyback on Senator Booker's presentation, the African-American athlete that he described, 56% chance of graduating, at Howard University, that's at 80%. So those resources we do expend. We are very happy to expend those resources. While we recognize the complexity of these issues, we also believe that there are compromises to be had that would appeal to all parties with a vested interest in potential legislative solutions. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony and for your advocacy for your institution and apparently your soccer skills too. So something new to look up about Howard University. We're now going to turn to Mr. Rod Gilmore, who is joining us remotely.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Rod Gilmore, and I'm pleased and honored to testify today. I played college football and baseball at Stanford University and graduated in 1982, a little bit before my friend, Senator Booker. He was a much better player, by the way. I graduated law school in 1986, and I've practiced law for 35 years. I also work in sports media and have covered college football since 1990, the last 25 years with ESPN. I am deeply familiar with the on-field and off-field issues facing college athletics, given that I've covered games for across the country and have relationships with coaches and players over the last 30 years. During those 30 years, I've watched the NCAA and its universities avail themselves of our country's free market economic system and compete for entertainment dollars and television revenues, competing against professional leagues like the NFL and the NBA. It is $14 billion a year industry. And despite the claims that almost no one makes money, people keep rushing into this enterprise. For example, in 1984, there were 105 college football teams in the top division of college football. Today, that number has increased to 130. While the NCAA, universities, coaches, and administrators have benefited handsomely from this lucrative marketplace, the NCAA stripped football and basketball players of their rights to share in this market. This restriction is arbitrary, does not help competitive balance, and is an affront to our free market system. Players are frustrated and upset. For more than 15 years, they've been asking for the right to market themselves like everyone else, including their fellow students. Remember, monetizing name, image, and likeness rights does not require any payment from the NCAA or a university. Rather, money is paid by an unrelated third party to a player for being permitted to use that player's name, image, or likeness in promotions or advertisements. However, the NCAA believes, and I have had coaches and administrators tell me this, that third parties will pay less to athletic departments if those third parties are allowed to pay players directly. In other words, the athletic departments want to protect their revenue stream, which is why the NCAA wants a national name, image, and likeness law. Today, I remind the committee that college football and basketball players have had no ability to negotiate nor change NCAA rules and have no legal authorized entity that can negotiate on their behalf. This has allowed the NCAA to focus on its self-interest and economic well-being, often at the expense of players. Players have been treated like second-class citizens without the right to enjoy the freedoms and the rights that the NCAA, every other student, and every other American enjoys, the right to fully participate in a free market. To me, this is also a civil rights issue. It is disturbing that the $14 billion a year revenue is made in large part on the backs of Black players. About half of the college football players in the top division and the richest conferences are Black. 56% of the players in Division I basketball are Black. But when their careers are over and former players look for opportunities in this lucrative industry, Black players find that it is not welcoming. It is an overwhelmingly white industry. According to recent studies, college coaching positions and leadership positions are 85% white. Name, image, and likeness may be the only true way players can share in this lucrative market. I believe the committee should really do the following three things. First, one, represent the players. The NCAA and its members do not need your protection. The players do. The NCAA is sophisticated, has experts, consultants supporting their efforts. Any action by this committee should be with an eye towards the best interests of the players who lack a formal organization or union to speak for them. Second, only create a national law if it benefits the players. Right now, the states have taken action that provide players with name, image, and likeness rights, and those laws give players choices. If the states have different rules, players have a choice to look at different jurisdictions in which to play college athletics. There is no compelling need for a national image and likeness law if the players already have that right given by the states. We're seeing the market act. The market is creating what the NCAA would not create. Three, only create a national law if it gives players something they don't have under the state laws. For example, group licensing. None of the state laws allow players to come together and promote a single product and share the benefits of having promoted that. Second, we need better healthcare protection during off-season workouts. You heard Senator Booker mention that we've had about 30 players die since the year 2000, often related to heat stroke. During that same period, only one NFL player has passed away. Something has to be done on this front. And then the final point, we need better post-eligibility healthcare for players. Most of the Power 5 conferences only provide 2 years of support. You heard Coach Few speak about Gonzaga and their ability to provide for 2 years. The Pac-12 provides for 4 years. It's just an inadequate time for chronic injuries and things that occur to players, and something has to be done about the state of concussions. There are 100+ concussion lawsuits pending against the NCAA currently, and as we heard earlier, there is not a consistent concussion protocol that's being used. If national name, image, and likeness laws only give the NCAA protections and guardrails and uniformity, then the players will have been let down. I hope this committee takes action and really focuses on the benefits to the players. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gilmore, and thank you for joining us remotely and talking about the differences in various states. We're now here for Dr. EMMERT from the NCAA. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And before I begin in my remarks, if I could, on a completely different subject, I want to congratulate the committee on the passage of the Endless Frontier Act. I spent the majority of my life leading research universities around America. What you did with that act and what the Senate did is remarkable, an extraordinarily important effort, and I really, really thank you for your leadership. It's going to make a huge difference for America. Chairman Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. Over the last decade, I've had the pleasure and privilege of serving as the president of the NCAA, which supports more than 500,000 student athletes who participate in sports every year on 19,000 different teams. The 1,200 colleges and universities of the NCAA are right now in the process of passing historic rules to allow new opportunities for student athletes to be compensated for the use of their name, image, and likeness. These opportunities will allow student athletes to take advantage of the evolving landscape in multiple ways, and our schools intend to pass those rules as quickly as possible, preferably before the end of the month. Like you, we also seek a level playing field that provides NIL opportunities for all college athletes in all the states and in a fair manner. This task is made virtually impossible by the many different name, image, and likeness laws that are passed at the state level, along with the ongoing recurring litigation threats. However well-intentioned the multiplicity of state laws are, they confuse rather than clarify the NFL landscape. This is why we are urging Congress to pass legislation creating a single national NIL standard. The schools that make up the NCAA membership have committed to allowing NIL opportunities to student athletes, and as you well know, our schools develop NCAA rules through a representative process that's not at all unlike the legislative processes in every state in the union. Thousands of student athletes, coaches, presidents, administrators, and stakeholders have provided extensive input into these rule changes. As a result, Divisions 1, 2, and 3 have developed proposed rules to allow students to benefit from the use of their NIL. Specifically, these rule changes would allow college athletes to be able to be compensated for activities such as third-party endorsements, social media opportunities, businesses they have started, and personal appearances they may make. Importantly, the proposal includes guardrails that would ensure that NIL payments are not a proxy for pay for play, that a national recruiting environment for college sports is maintained, and that students are not employees of their universities or their colleges. NCAA members are focused on enacting these rules well before the beginning of the 2021-22 academic year. Still, there's an urgent need for federal legislative solutions so that we may provide all student athletes with a broad NIL opportunity and a fair system of participation and competition. In order to do so, we urge that any federal NIL bill include 5 key elements. First of all, we obviously seek, as we all seem to agree to, a uniform national model under which students can benefit financially from the use of their NIL. Secondly, any provisions in this bill have to also support Title IX protections across all sports and provide for fair opportunities regardless of gender. Thirdly, we all recognize the need for preemption of state laws to provide the kind of consistency we all want across the country. And fourth, we need to safeguard the non-employment status of student athletes to maintain the core principles of collegiate athletics. And finally, as we have also heard, we seek a limited safe harbor protection to allow NIL opportunities to proceed without schools being under constant threat of serial litigation. With these provisions, a federal solution would maintain opportunities for college athletes in all sports, uphold Title IX protections, ensure that NIL payments are not a proxy for pay for play, and maintain the fairness in our recruiting processes around the country. We're proud of the role that college sports have played in creating opportunities for our nation's student athletes, especially for those who might otherwise have not had a chance to pursue a college degree. We know from countless stories and studies that NCAA athletes throughout their lives are more likely to be thriving and successful in all elements of their life, and that these patterns of success persist across all NCAA divisions, all graduation cohorts, gender, race, and ethnicities. Many of you have expressed concern about, and we've heard from a number of folks already, about the level of support that levels of support students receive beyond NIL, including making sure that student athletes have full access to and assistance with health care and health care costs, assuring scholarship provisions protect athletic educational opportunities throughout their careers, and the need to promote greater ability for transfer between schools. Please know that I and the schools have been continually addressing these issues, and as Coach Few noted, they have changed, these student welfare issues have changed remarkably within the past 5 years alone. And know that I'm committed personally to continuing to work with you in partnership to find solutions to all of those issues. I think most importantly, together we have an exceptional opportunity, I think frankly a historic opportunity, to change the national landscape for college athletics. While preserving all that college sports provides to our students and our communities, we can also support and encourage our students' NIL activities by giving them unique opportunities in life and preserving all those things that Coach Few talked about. Thank you for allowing me to provide input at this critical juncture. The schools of the NCAA are committed to working with you to find appropriate resolutions to these needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Emmert, for your testimony. We'll definitely have some questions on some of the issues for you and for Dr. Frederick. And so now let's turn to Mr. McCann.
Chairwoman Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker, and distinguished committee members, it is an honor to speak with you. My name is Michael McCann. I'm director of the Sports and Entertainment Law Institute at UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law. I also teach a course on name, image, and likeness, and my final class is tomorrow, fittingly. I also write for Sportico and Law Reviews. I'm also the author of Court Justice with former NBA player and UCLA basketball star Ed O'Bannon. I have 5 points which are detailed in my written testimony. First, NIL rights for college athletes are long overdue. These athletes have been denied a right enjoyed by the rest of us, the right of publicity, the right to control the use of what makes us who we are, our name, our likeness, our voice, our signature. Many college athletes are marketable. Billions of dollars are spent on their industry. Coaches, staff, companies that build arenas, they're all paid to help recruit athletes, the same athletes who are denied NIL. But money isn't what matters most about NIL. It's dignity. Ed O'Bannon's case led to thousands of college athletes being paid for their likenesses appearing in video games without their consent. Most were paid in the ballpark of $1,000 to $1,500. None got rich. That was never the point. It was, as Ed stresses, about fairness. Ed also emphasizes the disproportionate impact on students of color. The changes we're discussing today would address that impact. College athletes are college students, except with a different set of rights. A student who's a musician, an actor, an artist, an influencer, a cheerleader, an esports player can ordinarily earn without endangering a scholarship or getting a team in trouble or getting a coach fired. They can juggle their studies too. This is not just about the star quarterback. Per Axios, 8 of the 10 most followed Elite 8 basketball players from this year were women. They could earn through social media influencing. Other athletes could sponsor camps back home. We sometimes think of NIL as big endorsement deals, but it doesn't have to be that. NIL won't make many athletes rich, but it could make college a lot more affordable. And remember, only a tiny percentage of athletes ever turn pro. We can't forget that. Their chance to earn is while they're in school. Second point, learn from the states. as Senator Wicker noted, 18 governors have signed NIL bills. Several will take effect on July 1st. These laws are remarkably bipartisan and mostly similar. There are differences, sure, but that makes sense because states are the laboratories of democracy. We know that. They performed different experiments and came to different conclusions. One option is to let this state market play out. If one state finds that top recruits are signing in other states, it could adopt an NIL statute or perhaps make an existing one more athlete-friendly. That's the free market, but that's not necessarily the best market. That leads to my third point. A federal model, a national model would make more sense. Nearly 30 years ago, a Nevada statute guaranteeing protections in athletic disciplinary hearing institution. It interfered with the contractual relationship between the NCAA and member schools. It also impacted other states. To treat schools equally, the NCAA would have had to apply Nevada's statute in other states. And there was a patchwork problem, meaning other states could pass their own laws, and the NCAA couldn't enforce one rule nationally. NIL's different, I get that. It's mainly about the relationship between the athlete and a third party. Still, NIL impacts membership duties. They prevent schools from following NCAA rules, at least NCAA rules that are currently in place. They also create a patchwork problem themselves, as noted by other panelists. If every state is doing their own thing, how can there be one national rule? A federal standard would ensure that athletes are treated equally regardless of which state they're from. My fourth point, NIL reform should focus on NIL. There are many issues confronting college athletes. Inadequate health care, inequities, powerlessness. Senator Booker and Senator Blumenthal talked about them earlier. They are absolutely important, and we need to hear from athletes. Their stories should be told, and we need to hear from medical doctors, economists, civil rights leaders, and others. Those topics, however, intersect with multiple areas of law and policy. I encourage the committee, like most states have done, to focus NIL legislation on NIL. NIL gravitates towards one area of law, the right of publicity, and needs immediate attention. That doesn't mean the other topics aren't important. They should be addressed, and they ought to be addressed soon. Fifth, lastly, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. To that end, I have 10 suggestions for a federal NIL statute, and I'll say them quickly. First, it's reasonable for schools to deny athletes endorsements when they conflict with the school contract. Second, each school should be able to craft rules for permissible and impermissible endorsements. I teach at a public university, but I attended a Catholic college. There are differences, and schools should have that autonomy. Third, fair market review of endorsements is logical, but should be conducted independently and cautiously. Remember, other students don't have independent or fair market reviews of their dealings. Fourth, there should be some level of leeway in terms of the law and potential litigation, but I don't support an antitrust exemption. I think there are other means. Senator Wicker's bill talked about a compliance defense. That is a more reasonable approach in a transitionary period. Fifth, education on NIL is crucial. College athletes should know what signing a contract means, including tax implications. They're going to be independent contractors. And for some, let's not forget visa consequences. Some are not from the United States. What happens if they sign a contract? How does that affect their visa? Sixth, if a school helps their athletes with NIL opportunities, the assistance should be equitable for women and men and in full compliance with Title IX. Seventh, the bill should contain enforcement features. Athletes, as other speakers have noted, shouldn't be forgotten. They should have a private right of action. Eighth, a bill should permit adjustments later on. Make sure there are benchmarks. Some legislation talks about the Federal Trade Commission taking over college sports agents. That might be a good idea, but we don't know yet. They've never had that duty. Let's make sure there are benchmarks. Let's make sure we were able to adjust it later. Ninth, to avoid conflicts, the school and athletes should share summaries of their contracts and prospective contracts. Transparency needs to be a two-way street. 10th, video games and certain other products necessitate group licensing. That should be allowed. A trade association or a 501c4 nonprofit could be a vehicle that provides that. Thank you, and I stand ready to assist the committee further.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Mitten, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairwoman Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker, and members of this committee. It is an honor and my pleasure to testify before you today. My name is Matt Mitten. I am a professor of law and the executive director of the National Sports Law Institute at Marquette University Law School. For more than 30 years, I've been studying and writing about various college sports legal issues, including NCAA student-athlete eligibility rules and antitrust issues, which inform my strong agreement with Chairwoman Cantwell and Senator Wicker that it is extremely important for Congress to enact federal NIL legislation for intercollegiate athletes that becomes effective on July 1st of this year. As Senator Booker stated, there's an existential threat to college sports if this doesn't happen. A nationally uniform NIL rights law, which only Congress can establish, is essential to provide all intercollegiate athletes with the same rights that will both, one, enable them to earn fair market compensation from third parties for their authorized use, and two, preserve college sports as a unique and very popular brand distinct from professional sports that currently provides very beneficial athletic and educational opportunities to hundreds and thousands of student athletes and $3 billion annually collective value of the scholarships that NCAA athletes receive. National uniformity will prevent the continuing development of conflicting and differing state laws, as well as avoid the dangers and unintended consequences of professionalizing college sports and creating competitive balance inequities, especially for a substantial structural change that will for the first time permit student athletes to receive NIL income above the full cost of their university education, and that historically courts, including the O'Bannon Federal District Court, have upheld NCAA eligibility rules prohibiting student athletes from receiving NIL income as a valid means of maintaining its amateur education model of intercollegiate sports. A federal NIL rights law requires the following three provisions to achieve these objectives. One, preemption of the proliferation of state intercollegiate athletes' NIL laws, which are establishing a patchwork of differing and conflicting rules. Neither the NCAA nor its divisions 1, 2, or 3 can establish nationally uniform NIL rights laws for intercollegiate athletics that are certain to comply with all existing and future state NIL laws. Two, a very narrow safe harbor protecting national intercollegiate sports governing bodies and their member athletic conferences and educational institutions from prospective and retroactive federal or state antitrust immunity for adopting and enforcing rules consistent with the provisions of a federal NIL law, as well as their current rules prohibiting college athletes from receiving any NIL income. Without it, the NCAA will be forced to defend continuing antitrust litigation. For example, the pending House and Oliver cases were filed almost immediately after the NCAA Board of Governors directed Divisions 1, 2, and 3 to develop rules permitting student athletes to receive NIL compensation. These cases effectively assert that providing intercollegiate athletes with NIL rights precludes the NCAA's defense of antitrust litigation based on preservation of its traditional amateur education model of intercollegiate athletics. And three, explicit clarification that, consistent with the clear weight of judicial precedent, best explained by the Marshall case, this federal legislation does not create or define college athlete NIL rights to encompass or include the use of their names or athletic performances in any media broadcasts of games or sports events in which they participate. Otherwise, the unintended consequences of permitting intercollegiate athletes to receive pay for play and the professionalization of college sports may result as plaintiffs continue to relitigate this issue. Collectively, these three requirements will ensure that the only uncertain outcomes will be during on-court college sports competition, not in-court litigation. Finally, as a faculty member at a Division I AAA university like Gonzaga, the vast majority of which provide athletic department subsidies to fund their intercollegiate sports programs, I'm very concerned that including student-athlete health and safety requirements in a federal NIL bill will substantially increase their costs and have the unintended adverse consequence of eliminating non-revenue sports and significantly reducing athletic participation opportunities at NCAA, National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics, and National Junior College Athletic Association schools. Voluntary participation in intercollegiate sports necessarily involves assumption of the inherent risks of injury. As a former chair and member of the NCAA's Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports Committee, I know that schools can facilitate the effective treatment of these injuries, as well as significantly reduce the risk of aggravated injury and future adverse health effects by following the committee's recommended best practices. Thank you for considering my testimony, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. So obviously, a lot of material put on the table here, and I think it's our task now to take you all up on the notion that everybody wants to see NIL rights and see legislation. Question is, how are we going to get that done? And obviously, our colleagues have some very important viewpoints that need to be listened to. One area that I want to probe on, Dr. Frederick, you specifically mentioned the MEAC institutions and the notion that you only have limited ability to address some of these issues. Obviously, Coach Few and I would say probably the Pac-12 have been doing some of these things already and have created a standard. So we have been doing our own analysis, and to me, requiring Division I and Division II schools to help cover these healthcare costs would be an important goal for us to achieve. Dr. Emmert, what can the NCAA do now? Obviously, we heard Mr. Gilmore and others talk about the incredible amount of money that's in college sports today. What can you do to guarantee us that we could help with these institutions like Howard University or others who can't afford to have the out-of-pocket expenses that other institutions are currently handling?
Yeah, well, thank you, Senator, for the question. I think it's probably at the crux of much of this is there's general agreement, I suspect, among the panelists and others that student athletes ought not to be, as Coach Few articulated very nicely, not reaching into their pocket for covering independent expenses that are above and beyond their, or up to their deductibles, for example, in their insurance. And many of the Division I schools in the Power 5 conferences and others as well are doing so today. The question is, first of all, how would that language be crafted and what would be the size of the cost of all of this for schools? But having said that, if the focus was on what in Division I are often labeled by the NCAA members, the low-resource institutions, and those costs were simply out-of-pocket costs, doubtlessly there's a way to determine within Division I resources how to cover some of those costs. There's a variety of different vehicles for doing that. The challenge that everyone has to recognize is that, you know, there's no NCAA money, it's all the school's money, and so the NCAA serves as a pass-through. But if the member schools wanted, and I were willing to, and I would be willing to put this question to them, to say, okay, can we find a mechanism for funding out-of-pocket expenses in low-resource schools? It's certainly a doable phenomenon. It's that the amounts of money, at least based on the modeling we've done, are not unreasonable. Where it becomes very challenging is across Divisions 2 and 3. There's probably ways to ascertain how that might be done, but the devil will be in the detail. What is it precisely that they would need to be paying for? Is it just if it's out-of-pocket expenses, meaning those costs for the deductibles of a student athlete for sports-related injuries only for some fixed period of time, that might be a manageable amount of money with the dollars that flow through the NCAA distribution system.
To me, there's a lot of money in sports, and there's going to be a lot more money in sports. I'm a big believer that as we move towards internet models, there'll be lots of ways to monetize activities. So I would hope that we could make a commitment to help Dr. Frederick's institution and other MEC schools meet those obligations so that we could move forward. I get that not all the panelists are on the same point with this, but to me, this should be an easier yes, we can get this done. I want to ask Dr. Frederick, because this issue of heat impacts and horrific news of actual deaths from this, why can't we just get better health standards to cover the NCAA institutions to set a standard for what health could be, even if it's done here at a federal level, the guidance that must be followed by institutions?
Yeah. You know, I think this is an important point, and especially when you look around heat-related issues and concussions in particular, the NFL, for example, I think has been a model in terms of embracing this issue finally. And we have to have standards around where the athletes compete, et cetera. Once again, I think some of the issues here are around education and resources. We must insist that the number of trainers that are out there with the athletes and someone monitoring the conditions for the individual athletes are part of what is taking place. And this is not just only about heat and those things, but athletes get other issues. While I was at the University of Connecticut, there was a soccer player who I befriended who developed a testicular cancer that was metastatic. He had issues during practice that led to the discovery of this major mass in his abdomen. And as we talk about health-related expenses, his care, to UConn's credit, was taken care of fully, and he was allowed to graduate. So the other thing that I don't think we count as well is, while it does not happen often, there are issues that do impact athletes while they are in college that may not be related to their athletic endeavors that schools and colleges try to cover. And the last point I'll make is that Howard, for instance, like many schools, has a self-insured trust. And so the issue with how we cover health insurance is very different among all the institutions. And the problem with NCAA even stepping in is that for a self-insured trust, you just need one of those horrific incidents that costs you over $250,000 and triggers your excess layer. And right there, your budget, especially if it's a marginal budget. So of two of those incidents that cost $500,000 for the $14 million that we may expend is a huge deal at a Howard University. So putting into a fund, as Dr. EMMERT has suggested, is potentially one way to do that. And then the last thing is somebody has to be the arbiter of what constitutes an injury during the time that you were playing versus we sometimes recruit athletes who come to us with injuries, and then subsequent to that, who's going to be the arbiter if somebody shows up 2-3 years later with a chronic issue that actually occurred before they started playing for us. We're going to need some type of arbitration around that issue as well.
Thank you. Senator Wicker.
Well, thank you very much. And it's obvious that all 6 of these witnesses have put a great deal of thought into very excellent testimony. I really appreciate the efforts there. Let me start with you, Dr. Frederick. You come down on the side of a uniform national standard on paying, on allowing name, image, and likeness compensation. How would a patchwork of 51 different laws impact recruiting and fair competition among universities within your conference?
Yeah, I'll give you 2 examples. One is a personal example. I'll take my son to Philadelphia this weekend and play in a soccer game. Several coaches are going to look at him there. The coaches that are looking at him from North Carolina and New Jersey have 2 very different approaches. I got on Zoom calls with both sets of coaches. One set is talking about NIL rights. My son and I have no clue about his images he's going to market. And the other coaches are talking strictly about academics and his competition in school. So already, just as a parent, it is extremely confusing if you have 51 states with different laws as you're looking at schools trying to decide what type of experience your student would have. And then on the recruiting side, as a college administrator, I can tell you, we just started a Division I golf team. We have a young lady who has committed to us, and I know more about her clothing brand than her clothing company than I do about her golf game or her academics, because the recruiting atmosphere around that is very, very different. So our ability to compete in DC, where there's no such law and no such guidance, is going to be impossible as we try to recruit someone like that to us. And I mentioned Makur Maker, who's the only five-star basketball player that has come to an NCAA school. One of the challenges to an HBCU, one of the challenges we had in recruiting him was exactly that, the fact that soon enough laws were going to come to pass that would have left us unable to compete with other states where schools would have been able to offer him the opportunity for NIL.
Well, let me turn to Coach Few on the same thing. Now, Coach Few, the state of Washington does not have a state statute. Can you take a minute and tell us how that's going to affect your recruiting, or how that is affecting your recruiting?
I mean, it's in some ways it's impossible to project, but I mean, it in many ways it isn't. It will never be the same. I mean, we recruit nationally, even internationally, and you know, to not have the ability to compete on some sort of level playing field with people that can provide, you know, monetary gifts or endorsements or things like that would put us in a disadvantage that we couldn't make up. And I don't think the story of Gonzaga playing in 2 national championship games would ever happen if this was around prior.
Mr. Gilmore, you seem to be outnumbered on this panel 5-1, and I'm sure you're equal to that task. But your response to Coach Few, I guess, would be that's a decision that the duly elected leadership of the state of Washington made, and we ought to see how this plays out. I want to give you an opportunity, since it seems that 5 members of the panel have another view. Would you like to weigh in and respond to their testimony in that regard, with regard to the patchwork?
Of laws issue, I think we lose sight of the fact that the NCAA is operating a national business, and that is not unique in the United States. We have businesses every day that are forced to comply with laws in various states, and they do it quite well. And it hasn't created crazy, crazy chaos. There is some uniformity that is nice, that would certainly work for the NCAA. We understand that. But what seems to be coming across is a reluctance to participate fully in a free market and to have protections from a free market. And as you mentioned with the state of Washington is free to decide that they do not want to have laws that relate to name, image, and likeness, while Oregon next door may decide that they do, and that will have an impact on recruiting. We have seen in the last few months that what has happened in this era where states are making decisions about NIL, we have seen coaches and athletic directors and presidents go to state legislatures and say to them, hey, look, I want to be able to recruit effectively against my neighboring state, so we need legislation. And the market has been responding and providing that. So there is no doubt in my mind, and I think historically when we look at how markets have operated, that there will become some sort of equilibrium without the need for uniform law. I'm not against a uniform law. It's just that if we're going to have a uniform law, it needs to be very thoughtfully done about how we are helping players. For example, we talk a lot about guardrails, and the guardrails seem to be there to protect the NCAA and the institutions. We want to protect them from the marketplace. For example, you heard testimony earlier about, well, athletic departments should be protected against contracts that may conflict, where a player might can't have a contract that the athletic department has with a similar entity. Well, that's a market protection, and private parties normally can handle that with exclusivity. If the athletic department has the ability, let's say with an apparel company, to say you won't make a deal with any players, they can negotiate that. But to protect the revenue stream for the athletic department, and for example, say that a player cannot have, just to use an example, an agreement with Nike or Under Armour because the athletic department has one, is really prohibitive and isn't fair. It's a market protection for the university. And it very well may be that those contracts could coexist with players having the right to that kind of a sponsorship, but wearing the required university attire during university events. So the protections are a concern for me. And I also want to go back and address the cost issue for protecting players with health insurance. We seem to keep talking about this on an individual level for schools, and I was pleased to hear Dr. EMMERT talk about some possibility of some funding and revenue sharing. I think we need to remember that this is an overall enterprise which the NCAA and its member institutions have engaged in sports, and sometimes very dangerous sports. And they have this responsibility, one, to protect their players, and two, to comply with Title IX. And they ought to be charged collectively with making sure that that is done, and not simply whether you've got one rich school that can afford it and then another school that can't afford it. The NCAA and the member institutions have collectively decided that they want to be engaged in this, and at the very least, players should have the health care, the protection to know that they're safe in practice, and that when they're done playing, if they have chronic injuries or they have injuries that resulted from their playing, that they are protected. And it should not be simply said that, well, your university can't afford it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gilmore. And for colleagues, I have been pretty liberal today for various reasons of allowing people to go beyond their 5 minutes. But if members could help us out, because we have a number of members and I want them to get their questions in, and if people answering questions could also help us out there, that would be great. My colleague, Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Chairman Cantwell, and I'm really grateful for your leadership as well as your having this hearing today. You have been really extraordinary in pushing forward toward a bipartisan consensus that I think is within reach. I want to thank the ranking member as well for his leadership. Today is a banner day for Connecticut. We have become the 19th state to pass an NIL law, which we expect the governor to sign shortly. What we're seeing is a chain reaction of states filling a gap in protecting people. It is classically what happens in our federal system. I've been at consumer protection for 3 decades now, and this historical pattern is repeated every time, where states fill a gap and then a national standard is sought by a group that fears a patchwork. And I will tell you that I will oppose and help to block any NIL standard that is weaker than Connecticut's. I expect this Congress should block any NIL standard that is weaker than the strongest state standard. And we need to listen to the athletes. They are the ones who are all too frequently outnumbered in this conversation. And if you listen to the athletes, what they will tell you is they want more than just to be shown the money. They want more than just NIL. They want a strong, enforceable standard for health and safety and educational opportunity, because the overwhelming number of athletes in this country will never make a lot of money off NIL, but all too many of them will suffer life-changing injuries or deprivation of educational opportunity and other kinds of harm that we're seeking to pretend and protect against. Let's be very real here. The NCAA is at the table only because it's been hauled, kicking and screaming here after dithering and delaying too long. And they're here only because they fear that patchwork. The states are, in effect, running to the top. The NCAA, in its rules, nothing personal, Dr. Emmert, is racing to the bottom common denominator. And we have to avoid that happening. So I want to ask you, Dr. Emmert, taking your testimony here, and you've heard the statistic about 30 college football players dying from non-traumatic causes during workouts in 20 years, compared to only 1 in the NFL. Would you agree with me on behalf of the NCAA that schools that violate safety standards, especially intended to prevent concussions and heat stroke, should face enforcement actions with financial and operational consequences? That's part of what we believe is necessary in a college athlete's Bill of Rights.
Well, first of all, thank you, Senator. I think the questions that you and others have been raising about healthcare are obviously central to what the NCAA is about and what it was created for more than a century ago. If I might just make sure everyone understands, there are indeed science-based standards around many of the issues that were being talked about, including how to treat heat-related disorders, how to deal with concussions,
You know,
et cetera.
I apologize for interrupting, but,
quite all right.
you know, my time's limited. I think it's a yes or no answer. I hope the answer is yes. You do believe in such standards.
I believe there needs to be some system by which schools are well-educated, well aware of, and are expected to behave in a manner consistent with all the best medical practices out there.
Let me ask you, the Drake Group has called the NCAA's rules on sexual assault, quote, toothless, end quote, and, quote, woefully inadequate, end quote. There is a crisis of sexual assault in college sports. What's at stake here is more than just money. It's fairness and dignity, racial justice and gender equity. My hope is that the NCAA will commit to those principles as well.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Fredericks, because my time is limited, I'm going to be real quick in this question. You've expressed very understandable concerns about the cost impacts of these standards. The answer is very simply cost sharing. Some schools are rolling in money as a result of this almost $20 billion industry. If they share some of the cost of schools like Howard or others that are not profiting in the same way off the blood, sweat, and tears of athletes, wouldn't that allay some of your concerns? Thank you. Madam Chair, I'm going to observe your admonition and end my question there, but I'll pose some additional questions in writing.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you to Senator Thune and Senator Fisher for yielding to me to go next. And thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for this panel. This is one of the better panels, one of the best panels we've had on, certainly on this topic, but just generally in front of the Commerce Committee for a long time. Everyone has added to the debate and to my knowledge, and I think to my colleagues' knowledge. And while Senator Blumenthal sounded very vociferous there, he still remains my partner and colleague in trying to find a bipartisan compromise so that we can get something done. My view is that over the years, college athletics has grown into an increasingly profitable billion-dollar industry, but the rules surrounding athletic compensation has not kept pace. And I'm of the view that it absolutely needs to change. I believe it's important that we empower amateur athletes to capitalize on their name, image, and likeness. However, at the same time, I want to ensure the integrity of what I guess is called the collegiate model, but what it means to me is that we afford the opportunity for many students, student athletes, to receive an education. And if we don't do this right, those who receive the compensation from NIL may benefit at the demise of those who are playing in sports that are not, quote, profitable, and those who have no capability, therefore, of capitalizing on name, image, and likeness. And it seems to me that we know that college basketball and college football generally subsidize other sports and the athletes who get to participate in those programs. I've introduced a bill that is not necessarily the ideal bill even for me, the Athletes Protection and Compensation Act, but it's designed to find something that is the sweet spot that brings sides together and try to meet a July 1 deadline. Let me ask, first of all, on this July 1 deadline, Mr. Mitten, I want to visit with you, Professor. You started down a sentence. I thought you were going to end your sentence differently than you did, so I'm going to ask my question as the way I thought something you were going to say. As state laws go into effect and student athletes begin to hire agents, sign endorsement deals, and monetize their NIL, these athletes, then what happens on the occurrence if we're not have a law in effect by July 1? Student athletes and student college athletic programs progress under their state laws. They begin to adapt and comply with those laws. And if we fail to act by July 1, what confusion or challenges do we face, or do the athletes face, or the program? So my question is designed to elicit an answer about the importance of the July 1 deadline for Congress to act.
Thank you for that question, Senator. You know, the essence of sports is that everyone plays by the same rules. It's not only rules of the game, eligibility, but in this context, all student athletes nationwide, regardless of sport, should have exactly the same NIL rights. Not every state recognizes name, image, and likeness rights are often known as the right of publicity. There's only roughly 30 or so. There are going to be, as you know, others on this panel, including Coach Few mentioned, there's going to be a competitive advantage provided to certain schools. That's one thing that's very problematic. That's one of the other hallmarks of sports, is the uncertain outcome. It distinguishes sports from other forms of entertainment. So we certainly need to have that. So that's what I would say, is that it's just, the cat is going to be out of the bag, so to speak.
How do you put the cat back in the bag after July 1?
I don't think you can. I think that is exactly the problem. And Congress has to come up with, what's going to be the rule? Everyone plays by the same rules across the board. That's what I think is the most critically important thing.
Let me turn to one other topic in this venue of topics related to NIL. Commissioner Gloria Navarez of the West Coast Conference recently wrote that revenue sharing in college sports would be, quote, disastrous for women's sports. She went on to note that even though the WCC had won 9 national championships in soccer and 6 in tennis, men's basketball programs like that of Mr. Few's at Gonzaga, this is my words, not hers, quote, pays the lion's share of the cost of every other opportunity we provide in every other sport. The simple reality is that the only sports that generate necessary revenues to be self-sustaining are football and men's basketball, and all other sports rely upon those 2 sports to fund their operations. Dr. Fredericks or others, how do you think that the distribution of athletic revenue directly to student athletes would affect collegiate athletics in general?
It will impact it very negatively. Like I said, Howard has the only swim team at a historically black college and university. We have other minor sports that we will not be able to maintain if it becomes unequal, and especially in terms of recruiting, because as we talk about revenue, the television revenue that we generate is minuscule compared to these other.
Which will diminish the opportunities for all athletes, black, white, women, male, female. There's a consequence here more than just how we effectuate taking care of those athletes that can earn revenue based upon their name, image, and likeness, correct?
That's exactly right, because those athletes, if they would, that NIL, they will gravitate to certain areas. I know there's a discussion about other talents outside of athletics, but the reality is the bulk of where they will gravitate will be to the Power Five and the bigger schools where there's a media market.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Chairman.
you. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell and Ranking Member Wicker. I want to thank all of the testifiers. This is a new issue for me, so please bear with me. I have just a tactical question for us in the next 3 weeks. If we're trying to enact a national NIL standard, Dr. EMMERT, I'm trying to figure out why we would also try to complicate this matter by providing immunity against claims from former students. Like, what's that got to do with the subject at hand?
Well, thank you, Senator. It's a critical issue, as you've heard from a number of us. The reality is that there has been in the past, and there already is in place, a series of legal challenges that have, in my terms, fallen under the no good deed goes unpunished clause. And that means that as soon as, indeed, the Board of Governors told all of the divisions to begin to think through passing NIL rule changes at the NCAA, we immediately had lawsuits filed for our failure to have done so in the past. And those are 2 suits that are already pending as we speak. We want to do the right thing here. You've heard from everybody in this panel that passing an NIL bill at the congressional level is critical to moving forward, in part because we want to get this done and we want to do it and not be then immediately sued for having done the right thing in this case.
Professor McCann, you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. There are certain legal issues that would arise if Congress doesn't take action, and one would be the relationship between the NCAA and its member schools would vary by state. And in the past, and I'm not going to speak for President Emmer, but in the past, the NCAA has brought litigation over that issue. About 30 years ago, there was a case in Nevada that I mentioned earlier that if one state has one set of rules and another state has another, it interferes with the relationship between the national organization and its members. So I think that some type of national rule that is clearly the rule would mitigate that risk. Now,
But what's that got to do with indemnifying the NCAA for past
yeah,
violations? I don't get it.
sure, and I would separate those 2 things. to
Okay,
be
that's
clear.
all.
Yep, I would
that's all
separate those
wanted.
2 things.
Now, Dr. Emmert, is the NCAA planning, if Congress doesn't act soon, to file injunctions against states with NIL laws?
We've not taken that position yet. That decision would be up to the Board of Governors, a representative body of university presidents, but so far that decision has not been made.
Could you give me a sense of your decision-making process? Do you have a lean? Have you considered it? Is this under discussion?
It's been widely discussed, as you can imagine, but again, there's not been any decision made.
I get that there's no decision made, but you're here, and I'm asking you, what are you going to do? And I'd like you to give me a little clarity on where you are. It's absolutely true that procedurally you haven't decided. I'm asking you whether it's likely or not, what your thoughts are on this.
Again, it won't be my decision, it'll be the Board of Governors' decision, but I believe that for universities themselves to file lawsuits against their own states is a very challenging thing to do.
Okay, final question for Professor McCann. As we consider this legislation, the NCAA is asking to, in their words, clarify that athletes are not employees. The implications here, I mean, it sort of sounds benign and it even sounds logical to a certain extent, but the implications here are pretty significant. OSHA wouldn't have jurisdiction, EEOC wouldn't have jurisdiction, NLRB, the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. That seems to me to be a massively consequential choice here, and again, separate from the question of NIL. And I guess what I'm observing here, not an expert in this space, but an expert in legislative politics, if you will, is that Dr. Emmert is asking for a really big trade in exchange for a national NIL standard. And I don't think we're prepared to do that in terms of executing on it. And I'm not sure that these things are on point with the narrower question of NIL, and I'm wondering if you can comment there.
Yeah, I don't view that as a clarification. I view that as a massive change. I don't see the need to declare that college athletes are not employees. I think that's a separate issue from NIL. Moreover, that's an issue that has been addressed by the National Labor Relations Agency, NLRB, excuse me, and also the National Labor Relations Act. This is also an issue that varies by state, where some public universities and private universities are governed differently under that question. I don't see the need to address that in an NIL bill, just like I would say other things that we've talked about are separate from an NIL bill. Yeah, I don't view that, with respect, Dr. Emmer, I do not view that as a clarification. I view that as a massive change.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome. Thank you to the panel. This is a complicated subject and one that I really wish the NCAA would have been able to figure out, because, you know, there's certain things the federal government does well and certain things the federal government doesn't do well. This strikes me as something that we may not do well. And so I'm interested in hearing from you about what you think a proposal that should become law, if that's what we have to do, given the fact that states are now acting in the absence of NCAA action. And obviously, conferences don't follow state lines. We've got lots of multi-state conferences that could have different laws in place. So it seems to me that, you know, now we're in a position where we have to do something. But what we do is still a point of discussion. There are a couple of proposals I think you may be aware of that have been introduced by members of the Senate. I'm interested in your thoughts about either or both of those, and there may be perhaps others, but more than anything else, I just think that you're in a much better position to guide this process in terms of what a potential set of rules might look like than maybe we are. And, but I've been very interested in this discussion we were just having about employer-employee, and I think, Dr. Emmert, you mentioned that in your written statement at least, that you didn't think that you couldn't support anything that would essentially create an employer-employee relationship. And I would just ask you to sort of reiterate your view on why that's something that you prerequisite for legislation.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Thune. The issue of employment status versus being a traditional student athlete, as that's been defined historically, is really at the core of what college sports is all about. If student athletes are classified as employees of their university, their college or university, it is, as Senator Schatz pointed out, it does change very fundamentally the nature of that relationship. It moves student athletes out from underneath the guise of education law, for example, to employment law. I believe that's what the good senator was alluding to. And for one, that means Title IX is no longer relevant to college athletics because that's education law, not employment law. It changes the relationship between Coach Few and as a student athlete says coach-student to employer-employee. It changes everything about what college sports really is and why we have created college sports 120-some years ago. So everybody in higher education sees that question as one of the core issues to defining college sports versus professional athletics.
So and just again, by way of, I come from a state, we don't have, we have two mid-major universities and a number of Division II schools in South Dakota. And you've touched on this a little bit, I think some of you have in responses to questions already. But how do you see this playing for you know, a University of South Dakota or a South Dakota State University where you've got a mid-major program, the transfer portal already, which I think is very much a benefit to athletes, makes it harder, I think, for a lot of those types of schools to keep athletes, retain athletes once they get them there. But how will this affect recruiting athletes, and does it put those types of universities at a competitive disadvantage relative to a Power 5 conference?
Well, I think, first of all, Coach Few could answer part of that question very, very, very well. I think especially with the patchwork that we're going to see starting July 1, those schools that are in states that allow name, image, and likeness opportunities are going to have an enormous advantage in the transfer portal as well, because student athletes will indeed be looking for opportunities to transfer to schools where they can monetize their name, image, and likeness. It's one of the reasons we need of course, the nationalized rule. The second component is we need those set of guardrails that we've been describing so that students can monetize their name, image, and likeness, but it's not being used as a recruiting inducement. Absent some guardrails, coaches and others will, in the recruitment process, be including in their recruitment pitch a specific opportunity for a specific contract or a specific endorsement deal at a specific place. That's precisely what we want to avoid. And the legislation that's been discussed here in this chamber has always included those kind of guardrails.
Coach, any comments on how it would impact?
Thanks, Senator. Absolutely. I mean, the impact would be enormous. And if you were from a state like South Dakota or Washington, you would be put at a huge competitive disadvantage and one that would be very difficult to make up, both when the student athletes are coming out of high school, but also, you know, as they have the opportunity to transfer. And, you know, speaking to Dr. Emmert's point, you know, having some sort of parameters in line so we can keep some sort of semblance of competitive equity in recruiting, you know, where we're talking about, you know, each of us being able to give a similar experience to these players, and it not turning into basically a bidding war where it's just monetarily based.
And that's what I'm afraid what could happen and what we obviously have to avoid. And Madam Chair, again, I would say I think it would be a benefit to all of us to hear specifically from people who I consider to be experts who deal with this every day, what they think this might look like if we are to legislate on this. And it sounds like from a time standpoint, we don't have a lot of time. We need to come up with something in fairly short order. So I hope we can get working on that right away.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Thune. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell, and I want to thank the panel for being here today. I appreciate your commitment to making sure that not only do we have a good opportunity for student athletes, but we have good universities behind them. Dr. Emmert, thank you for being here. Thank you for the conversations we've had before. I'm sure that the NCAA has monitored probably all 19 of the NILs that's coming out of the recent states. Can you, and I don't want to spend all day on this, but can you tell me one that's particularly unworkable?
There are various, first of all, good afternoon, Senator, good to be with you again. But the corpus of the state laws around what can be included in NIL is largely similar. There are other elements around them that are highly disparate. And some of them, for example, allow third parties, independent third parties, to provide cash benefits to student athletes for a variety of their personal needs. That would be extremely disruptive to the recruitment system that Coach was referring to.
Okay, so I think it's a little different than most laws when done by a state. And I'll tell you why, because I think that there's some opportunities here. Sports is important, probably more important than it should be. Okay, but you have a state, I don't want to pick any schools, but you know, one of the big boys, and the state legislature can make this law so it gives them an incredible recruiting advantage in the overall mix of things. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and we're seeing that play out in reality.
And so would you also agree then that if we were to do a national bill that would apply evenly across the board, so it wouldn't be a patchwork, that would be something that could help our student athletes and help the universities behind them?
I think it's the only sensible approach to this. So yes, indeed, I do.
So I want to go back to another thing and that deals with health and safety measures. I am told that they're voluntary currently. Is that true?
There is not an enforcement system in place at the national level. Every university is expected to follow all of the health and welfare protocol that are in place. And when they fail to do so, it's usually dealt with at the institutional level and at the state level.
And I would just say that hopefully the NCAA is monitoring that and giving some advice, because quite frankly, you got an 18, 19-year-old kid that doesn't know fully how his body works anyway, or her body works anyway, and to be put in positions they might not know when their body is truly in distress, okay?
Yes, we do very much that. I can talk with you offline about all of the ways in which that
Okay.
occurs, Senator, but yes, that's a very important aspect of what we do out of the national office.
Okay. I want to talk about, would you be opposed, for instance, for the universities across the board, if it's in there, that they could do things like give them tools like iPads and things like that, as far as helping move the ball along?
Yeah, not only would I not be opposed, that in fact happens now and is consistent with the rules that exist.
Okay, good, good. I am the same with Senator Thune, as you well know, being an MSU person yourself at one point in time. I'm very concerned that if we set up a patchwork, and I don't want, I mean, there's a thought we could actually benefit in Montana from it. We got no pro football team. They'd be the big dogs. But the truth is I want it to be even. I want it to be equitable. I want it to have a fair shot at stuff. And look, Coach Few has done a great job taking Gonzaga to a whole different level that they weren't at 30 years ago. They can live off that for a while, and maybe forever. But the truth is things ebb and flow. And if the NIL, and we need to keep the student athlete in mind here, if the NIL isn't done right, isn't it a fact that it would impact all the other sports that are out there, that gives opportunity for a lot of folks that we never see on TV, that ESPN never reports on, and would actually take away opportunity from them?
I think the failure to pass a national standard would indeed deny them that opportunity you're talking about. I believe that, in fact, there's plenty of data to support it, that student athletes from less visible sports, from less visible institutions, can have remarkable impacts, especially in the social media world, and that a place like Montana State, by the way, Senator, once a Bobcat, kind of always a Bobcat. Hope that doesn't offend
Amen,
you.
brother. Yeah.
So I hope that that it would actually provide opportunities that don't exist today for student athletes in a place like Havre, Montana.
Amen. Look, this is a solvable deal. It's going to take folks communicating. It's going to take everybody at the table, as you well know. And it's going to take the leadership of the chairman of this committee. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Appreciate you being here. We're going to Senator Fisher remotely.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell. I appreciate all the witnesses that we have here today to discuss NIL policy considerations for our student athletes. As you know, 21 state legislatures have enacted NIL legislation to date, and several more states are in the process of passing their own NIL bills. With so many state activities that are happening on this issue, there are a lot of questions about how we maintain that level playing field. And this concerns not only equity among states, but also equity among institutions at the same conference, sports at the same institution, and student athletes in the same sport. Professor McGann, you mentioned that student-centered resources provided by colleges for NIL should be furnished consistent with Title IX. How do you envision maintaining the spirit and the legal requirements of Title IX as the implementation of NIL legislation moves forward?
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. I think as a starting point, there need to be procedures in place for compliance officers at schools to ensure that when student athletes are presented with potential opportunities, including social media opportunities, that they are not advised in a way that's geared to help mainly the men's players, specifically the players on the football team and the basketball team. So as a starting point, there need to be some sort of procedures in place. And then secondly, what we've seen is that a lot of schools are turning to companies to represent them in terms of NIL opportunities for their athletes. That process has to be monitored to make sure, I think, to make sure that Title IX isn't being shielded or veiled by using a third party. That if a private company is involved with providing advice, I think it needs to be done in a way that ensures that the advice is equitable for the women and men on the teams. Because I worry a bit that if there are other companies involved, that we won't have the transparency to know what's going on in terms of the advice that are being provided to the student athletes. And I also think it's just as an educational point, a lot of them are not going to have agents. A lot of them are going to have a chance to sponsor a camp back home. Things like that, more modest, incremental steps in their lives. And for them, they're going to need help. They're not going to go hire a lawyer. They're not going to hire an agent. What happens if they're a YouTube influencer? Who's going to review that contract? There need to be educational opportunities to make sure that they're not taken advantage of.
Right. You know, we've heard quite a bit today about the state-by-state approach. What would you say are the biggest potential risks with that approach, and whether it's for Title IX or other key considerations that you've outlined?
Well, Senator, I think as a starting point, I know Dr. Emmert didn't talk about the legal implications, and I understand why, but I do think if it goes to state by state, we could see litigation. So that's not the end of the world. You know, I'm a lawyer, so we go to court. It's not always a bad thing, but I don't know if that would be in the best interest of the athletes or the schools. So there's that.
Okay.
And then secondly, the recruiting aspect that was talked about. Now, we could do the state-by-state free market approach, and states could jockey with each other to make the most athlete-friendly laws. And hey, look, with sports betting, that's what's happened. With other industries, that's happened. But I do think once we go the state-by-state approach, the door's shut. It's going to be very hard to get back in once states adapt their own rules and become accustomed to them.
Among the states that have enacted the NIL legislation, Nebraska included a provision that is giving flexibility for colleges and universities to adopt the NIL rules early if need be. President Frederick and President Emmert, I'd like to focus on universities' roles in the NIL conversation. Would you both please comment on how universities can ensure compliance and help our student athletes navigate this really complicated landscape of state NIL laws, NCAA rules, and institutional policies, please?
Yeah, we will certainly have to do so with great difficulty, because every time we recruit a student, depending on what the setup is, we'll have to look at that. And I think it's akin to having a seatbelt law that's different in 51 states. Somebody driving from New Jersey to North Carolina can take their seatbelt off on the way and have different laws, and I don't think we want that. So doing it with different state laws is going to be difficult. And then if you are in a state or the District of Columbia, as Howard is, trying to assist with recruiting compliance around these issues while recruiting athletes is also going to be very difficult. The other concern, the last concern that I have is like pro sports, when athletes do compete in different states, they are subject to tax laws, as an example. Would there be loopholes in the law that allow NIL, even if you're in a state that doesn't have it, for the athletes that are competing in conferences that may be going to multiple states? And I think that when we talk about lawsuits that could be filed, we are risking an opportunity there for having loopholes where people may begin to file lawsuits because they're being denied an opportunity for NIL because the state does not have a law that's passed.
Senator Fisher, I think you put your finger on one of the most important reasons for having a national standard, and that is the difficulty that individual athletes, individual recruits, individual schools and coaches, compliance officers on the campuses will have in trying to navigate all this catchwork of policies and rules. Imagine an athlete that Coach Few might be recruiting. That athlete is looking at multiple schools in multiple states, and maybe an international student. They would have to pause and think about, as Dr. Frederick said, the tax implications in one state versus another state. What does this all look like and mean? And then schools themselves would have to figure out, how do I advise our student athletes and provide them with the kind of support that Professor McCann was talking about based upon their states. And then even what rules apply to a student athlete, is it the rules at the state where they're playing, or the rules in the state that they come from, the rules in the state that they're going to go conduct a camp in. All of that becomes highly variable, and it's one of the primary reasons we need to respond with an effective approach to all of this. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam
Yeah,
Chairman.
thank you. Senator